Well, Paul and your team, thank you very much indeed for this warm welcome, literally and emotionally, to the Leeds Salon. Thank you all very much for being here and not out there on the lovely piazzas of Leeds, having a glass of wine or beer. It's a very nice introduction, and also I'm minded to start where I was going to end, which is to say, someone just asked me who my next book is about, and it's Sylvia Pankhurst. Dan, I need the movie. We'll talk afterwards. But that's a really nice context. Thank you. Eleanor Marx did come to Leeds, in fact, and I shall tell you a little bit about that in the course of my chat. But it's something of a homecoming. My father was a son of Armley, and my sister, who's a writer and editor and publisher, is here, and she was born and brought up here as well. So we're not strangers to Leeds. I thought we'd start by spending a little bit of time with the family. As Paul mentioned, what's the broader context of a thinker or a philosopher like a Karl Marx before we have Eleanor Marxism. And I'll start with a reading just to put her in the context, spend a little bit of time with the family, and then just sort of touch on thinking about who she was and what her career was and what contribution she made to British politics, political thought and culture, and European and international. And I think I completely agree with Paul that that's how I feel about her, that she was one of the most important political figures and thinkers in Britain of the second half of the 19th century. And as a socialist and a feminist and a trade unionist and an internationalist, and those were the sort of four key things of her political career, she was absolutely grounded in that work, both actively but in her writing. And that is, you can already tell, in quite marked distinction from her father's career, from out of whose ideas she developed. Eleanor Marx changed the world, and in the process, she revolutionized herself. This is the story of how she did it. She seems an unfashionable subject, and then there's her father. Yet the public Eleanor Marx is one of British history's great heroes. The private Eleanor Marx was the favourite daughter of an unusual family. She was nicknamed Tussie to rhyme, her parents said, with pussy, not fussy. Cats she adored, fussy she wasn't. She loved Shakespeare, Ibsen, both the Shelleys, good poetry and bad puns. White was her favourite colour, and champagne her idea of happiness. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, she was the first champagne socialist, not Friedrich Engels. But we should say, not that she needs any defence, but that at that time it was German sect, of course, from the Rhineland. It was before the French had said you can't call anything that's fizzy and white other than champagne. The life of Eleanor Marx was one of the most significant and interesting events in the evolution of social democracy in Victorian Britain. Not since Mary Wollstonecraft had any woman made such a profound, progressive contribution to English political thought and action. She left a colossal, although unacknowledged, legacy for future generations. Eleanor Marx was a revolutionary woman writer, a revolutionary woman, and a revolutionary. She was a person of words and action. Social democracy and radical thought were the family trade, not for profit, but for the progressive transformation of people's lives for the better. Eleanor's parents and the man she called her second father, Friedrich Engels, were children of industrial capitalism. They grew into political adulthood in the revolutionary Europe of the 1840s, but their mature ideas were forged from the ashes of that early utopian and socialist idealism. The global triumph of capitalism was declared in the decades after 1848. Their child, Eleanor, born in 1855, was heir to their ideas in a different modern age. Eleanor went out into the world to put into practice and to test what she'd learned from Marx and Engels at the family hearth. Her quest to go ahead, that was her lifelong favourite motto, to live it, soon took her into new worlds. The Shakespeare revival, the cultural realms of radical modern theatre, the contemporary novel, and the artistic circles of early Bohemian Bloomsbury. She loved steam trains and was an early and enthusiastic adopter of new technology, most notably the typewriter. She tried to unionise typists, but that's another story. Eleanor Marx was a pioneer of Ibsenism in Britain. She translated Flaubert's Madame Bovary into English for the first time. She took to the stage herself with sometimes hilariously misdirected results. She was a very bad actor, I'll come back to that. She never noticed any boundaries between the personal and political, even when she tripped over them and they sent her flying. What is it that we as socialists desire? Asked Eleanor Marx, and spent her life searching for answers to this question. From the time of her early childhood, the 1860s, socialism was the ideology primarily associated with the new democratic struggle against capitalism. There is no neat story of the origins and rise of socialism in Britain because it was by character and intent a broad-based, diverse alliance of widespread radical thought and action. And Tussi's life is one of the significant primary elements in the composition of the story of British socialism. As the late, great Eric Hobsbawm observed, in the 1860s and 1870s, native socialists in Britain might have comfortably fitted into one smallish hall. Eleanor, the only Marx who was a native English socialist, and her friends might have filled more than half that hall. Certainly, Eleanor said, socialism is at present in this country little more than a literary movement. She took this literary movement from its visionary pages onto the streets and onto the political stage. She lived it and she tested it. And indeed, born in 1855, cast your mind back to 1855, it's January, it's the 16th of January, and it's a garret in Dean Street, which at that time is not at the centre of fashionable Soho, with a champagne bar underneath in the Quo Vadis restaurant, as it is now in well-heeled central London. But it is, of course, the melting pot, a phrase that was actually coined by her friend Israel Zangwill, the Jewish Dickens, as he was known, who she wrote with later in life, of immigrants and political exiles who, like her own family, like her own father, had washed up in Britain in the wake of the failure of the 1848 revolutions. And the Marx family had been kicked out of France, kicked out of Belgium, and Britain was the last place that they could come to. And she's born in 1855, and she's born into a household where there is a son dying. And Marx, as in Karl Marx, Marx loved women, and he was a great believer in women's equality. He never theorised it, though. But nevertheless, like all good Victorian patriarchs, since and even today, he wanted a son. And they had had many children, and several of those children had been boys, and unfortunately they had all died. And Edgar, the last surviving son, was coughing out his lungs in the next room. There was a main room and there was the box room as Eleanor was born. And within 12 weeks, 16 weeks, he's dead. And Marx is devastated. And there's quite a gap between Eleanor and her middle and her eldest sister, who are the only surviving children. Jenny, who's the eldest sister, whose first language is French, and then Laura, her middle sister, whose first language is also French. But Jenny had some German as well. Her father, of course, is a native-born German speaker, whose English was really ropey when he first arrived in Britain. His wife, Jenny von Westphalen, spoke very good English. But I've just sort of mentioned those things because it was a very, very multilingual household, polylingual, multilingual. But this was not unusual in their community. And one of the things that I really learned profoundly from writing and researching and writing this book was how, if I may put it this way, how less parochial 19th century Britain was culturally in some ways than it has become now. In that context of how diverse it was and how international and European it was in its thinking about art and politics and literature. And of course, Eleanor grows up as the darling of this family and her father's favourite, clearly from an early age. And he is writing a book that started out as a 30 to 50 page essay that his friend Engels said, look, you need to shut up your critics, and also you need to explain to people just basically what your ideas are. So write a 30 to 50 page essay about this idea of capital and historical materialism, and that will help. And that 30 to 50 page essay is famously what became 4 volumes of Capital, the first volume of which Marx was writing in the first 9 years of Eleanor's life, as she, a child who was homeschooled, not because they were poor at that time, but because girls of any class didn't go to school. Leslie Stephen, Virginia Woolf's Sir Leslie Stephen, you know, Virginia Woolf's extremely wealthy father didn't want his daughters educated any more than people who had no money would also, you know, like access to education for girls and boys. So she was homeschooled. But let's face it, if you're going to be homeschooled, have Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels as your kind of homeschoolers is quite good, really, isn't it? Because not only is Marx, as he's got this great brain box, as Fred used to call it, but Engels himself was an extraordinary intellect and reader, and like Marx, lover of literature. Both of them started out as young radicals wanting to be poets. You know, as they do. I think it used to be poets and now it's pop stars, and then, you know, and then boys kind of like become novelists instead. So the Engels was, as well as having a great reach in terms of sort of philosophical history and military history, he also had a great knowledge of Old Icelandic and the Shahnameh, the Lives of the Shahs, which is the great sort of Persian, you know, Arabic texts, and from which Eleanor Marx learned about the origins of chess, which she really enjoyed playing with her father, and she was one of 2 people who could beat him. And one of the people who could beat him was Lenchen, Helen de Muth, who was the family housekeeper, who had been with Marx and his wife Jenny since she was 12 years old, and Jenny was a teenager, already in love with the young Karl Marx, who she'd met when he was in short trousers. But here is Eleanor Marx literally scribbling on her father's notebooks and on her sister's notebooks, and this very indulgent father, because Marx was great with kids, that's one of the defining things about him, is sharing with her the blue books and the bits of Shakespeare and the history of, you know, of the English Revolution and the Chartists and France and so on, while he's writing this book, Capital. And so when we say that, like, the ideas of historical materialism and the ideas in Capital, and indeed of the emergence of a kind of idea of democratic socialism, which Eleanor Marx takes forward, are in her DNA, I mean it quite literally, that she was just inhaling that, you know, through those 9 years at the greaseproof wax table. I'd like to just pause for a short reading for change of tempo, but also to pause on something which is about why this book, or why Eleanor Marx speaks to me or spoke to me as a subject. And, you know, people say, like, why do you choose that subject? And my answer is kind of like a spooky one, and I am not remotely spooky or mystical, but in the end they do come up and give you a tap on the shoulder, except in Eleanor Marx's case she came up and it was a very firm kind of, you know, and I'm like, no. I'm not taking on because if I had to take on a Marx, I'm going to have to take on Engels, and I'm going to have to take on all of that, and it's too much, you know, and then it's like, of course, and this is where you end up. But I started the book 10 years ago, roughly, and one of the things that has happened and developed along the time has been a change in Britain, which was Eleanor Marx's homeland. English was her first language, although she spoke many others. Have been many challenges around civil rights, around human rights, around internationalism, around security, and of course it never stops to be in my mind that Eleanor Marx was growing up in a family whose father was considered a terrorist, an enemy of the state, and they were constantly under surveillance by the British state and by the Prussians. And so she understood about sort of living within that context. But I do rather love this because Agent Stieber was an agent who infiltrated himself into the Marx and Engels circle. And he wasn't a British agent, and the Americans, Pinkertons, used to spy on them as well. But he was actually a Prussian agent sent by the Prussian Minister of the Interior. So that's kind of quite scary, really. But the Prussian Minister of Interior was Jenny Marx's, so Mama Jenny Marx's, half-brother, unfortunately. So it really is a family affair. Who was absolutely incandescent when he discovered that his very talented, lovely, slightly sort of rather rebellious, she used to wear the tricolour in her hair, and was very radical and used to speak. This is the young Jenny Marx. So by the way, if you read any of those accounts that say that she was the stuffy, bourgeois, posh one who was always very dour, that is not the case. That's a version of how she's been presented. And in fact, it was the young Marx who looked up at her and wrote awful, drivelling poetry, but who looked up at her and was inspired by this young woman, very much like Trotsky was conscientized, as we used to say in South Africa, by the first Mrs. Trotsky, who taught him about politics. Anyway, here is Agent Stieber sent by Ferdinand, who had been so furious when he discovered that his half-sister was going to marry Karl Marx. Marx lives in one of the worst and hence cheapest quarters of London. He has 2 rooms, the one with the view of the street being the drawing room, behind it the bedroom. There is not one piece of good solid furniture in the entire flat. Everything is broken, tattered and torn, finger-thick dust everywhere, and everything in the greatest disorder. A large old-fashioned table, covered with waxcloth, stands in the middle of the drawing room. On it lie manuscripts, books, newspapers, then the children's toys, bits and pieces from his wife's sewing basket. Next to it a few teacups with broken rims, dirty spoons, knives, forks, candlesticks, ink pot, glasses, Dutch clay pipes, tobacco ash, in a word, all kinds of trash. And everything on one table. A junk dealer would be ashamed of it. When you enter the Marx flat, your sight is dimmed by coal and tobacco smoke. Like her father, Eleanor was a chain smoker, although he smoked pipes and cheroots, and she smoked tobacco, and then and ready-made cigarettes that actually, came out in her later lifetime. You grope around at first as if you were in a cave until your eyes get used to these fumes. Everything is dirty, everything covered with dust. It is dangerous to sit down. It was very dangerous to be an agent in the 19th century. Here is a chair leg with only 3 legs. There the children play kitchen on another chair that happens to be whole. True, it is offered to the visitor. But the children's kitchen is not removed. If you sit on it, you risk a pair of trousers. But nothing of this embarrasses Marx or his wife in the least. You are received in the friendliest manner, are cordially offered a pipe, tobacco, and whatever else there is. A spirited conversation makes up for the domestic defects, and in the end, steady on, Agent Stieber, and in the end you become reconciled because of the company. Find it interesting, even original. This is the faithful portrait of the family life of the communist leader, Marx. I fear that as all our surveillance is done by ourselves buying our iPhones and smartphones, that such interesting reports may become fewer and further apart for the biographer of the future. Eleanor Marx had many different aspects to her life and career, and they all run in parallel, and as well as being in her early life, her father's researcher and deviling for him in the library and helping him a great deal, a role that she took over from her mother had had it originally, then her older sister Jenny had it, and then her middle sister Laura. But this is, of course, one of the reasons why she was one of the few people who was able to decipher his handwriting, which is why after he died, Engels put her in charge of sorting out and translating and organising the 12 to 14 boxes of jumbled papers and essays and bundles which became the translations that were Capital. But there were many other essays as well, and throughout her life that was one of the things that she did. And I began to realise as I studied her that I was also discovering two things: that Eleanor was the person who was most responsible for constructing her father's manuscript and philosophical and political legacy, and recasting them and editing them. So great essays like Value, Price and Profit, beautifully written, are things that she did later in life and have her hand on them. But at the same time, she had her own career and she wrote her own stuff. And I mentioned earlier that the key pillars of her life, as well as being fascinated by theatre and interested in Ibsen, who in fact she introduced into Britain, translating Madame Bovary by Flaubert, which is kind of uncanny because unfortunately her death rather mirrors and resembles Emma Bovary's demise, but that's a story for another day. But she did, for me, very significantly do two things which very substantially both took forward her father's, Marx and Engels, intellectual and political legacies, but actually developed them on to a different place. And that one is that she is the mother of socialist feminism, and the other is that she is one of the founders of the British trade union movement. And on those two things, in passing or in part, one was that with the question of socialist feminism, she got from Marx historical materialism and a socialist analysis from Capital. From Engels, because Engels was thinking about what's the role of women. So he wrote that wonderful book, The Origins of Private Property, Family and the State. And in that has that fantastic insight about the fact that the sexual division of labour has to be an a priori, has to be a pre-existing condition for capitalism to function, and that without the gendered sexual division of labour, the reproduction of the means of production, as he puts it, can't happen, which is a fantastic economic analysis and insight. But he then doesn't go on to theorise how to change it. And one of the things that I try and show in the book is that Eleanor Marx spent her life doing that. And so she put together the ideas of Marx and Engels, the ideas of socialism and historical materialism, with emerging ideas of feminism. And you notice I use the word feminism, not women's rights, because she was not a supporter of bourgeois equality. She was not a supporter of rights only for women of a certain class, or of a certain background, but saw it as something that had to happen across all levels of society, and both for men and women. And she came up with socialist feminism. And there is this fantastic dynamite essay. It's only 19 or 20 pages. Read it. And one of the great joys of working in the modern age is that you can actually say, go and have a look at this. It's online, you know. And in this, she lays out very clearly her program for socialist feminism, and how that looks. And she talks about the personal and the home as well as the political. And in fact, and she talks about Nora Helmer, because she's very, very interested in Ibsen. And her failure as an actor is really important, because she longed, like lots of little girls, she longed to be an actress when she was little. And she could quote, great reams of bits of Shakespeare, and she could do Richard III, and she could do the Scottish play. And you're noticing a theme here, and she could do Julius Caesar. And then eventually she persuaded Marx, because she couldn't get away, because he quite rightly was trying to protect her from running away and marrying, like her sisters had, impecunious philosophers, which both of her sisters had done. And he should know. And but eventually, and he said, no, you can't go, because you'll hang out in theatres with people that take drugs and drink too much and are kind of, I don't know, kind of deviant. And she's like, yes, that's exactly why I want to do it. But what happened with Eleanor Marx is she started doing her training, and what's the first thing that she gets in her late 20s? The Juliet speech. And suddenly she realises that being a woman, that there aren't the roles she wants to play, the trouser roles. She'd forgotten that point, as we all do as kids. And so Ibsen, and of course you can suddenly see, this is very interesting. Here is this man looking at the social and economic and intimate relations between people and looking at the frustrations of women. So Nora Helmer becomes a very important figure for her, and Nora Helmer is as much part of her analysis of socialist feminism, her forging of that idea, as many other aspects around equal pay and trade unionism and so on. So for me, it's really, really important that she is this founding philosopher and theorizer, but she is also an activist. She is very practical. And she becomes, along with male trade union leaders whose names that you will, John Burns and Will Thorne, that you will recognise very well, the founder of the mighty Gas Workers Union. And she participates and leads the gas workers' strike and the dock workers' strike. So there's this great wave of new unionism in the late 1880s, early 1890s that reforges a whole different way of approaching unionisation. And I recently came back from Dublin, from the GMB Congress, where I was very honoured to be invited to go and to speak for the second time. They invited me last year, and the GMB, of course, as you will recognise, the biggest trade union of Great Britain, which has a membership of 620,000 people, which is more than all the political parties in this country combined at this moment, was founded by Eleanor Marx and by Will Thorne, who then went on to become the first leader of the Trade Union Congress. And in fact, I am going to do a thing with the TUC of Battersea and Wandsworth soon, because he was there and we're doing a Burns walk and so on. But one of the things that's very interesting to me being at the GMB is that Eleanor Marx was one of its leaders, right, then, and would have been delighted but also horrified to discover that the first woman leader of the Trade Union Congress, the wonderful Frances O'Grady, who is our current General Secretary, only became led by a woman so recently in recent years. But I am happy to say that I walked into the GMB Congress in Dublin, and it was the first time it's been held there since 1891. And the last time it was held in Dublin in 1891, Eleanor Marx and Will Thorne were there. And they on a great sort of truck, on the back of a sort of barrow truck, and stood on a platform, and she stood next to the Comrade boys, and they all put forward a resolution, and the resolution was about sending working men to Parliament and also that the parliamentarians should be paid, that there had to be salaries and wages so that ordinary people could do it. And Eleanor voted and internationalism, voting for the principles of the resolutions of the International. She also worked in all the internationals, literally from her teenage years, to be implemented. But there was one thing that she alone, as one of the two leaders of that already mighty union, opposed and stood down. And that was that she challenged the resolution for the suffrage, the right to vote for all men. And this is 1891, and she stands up there and she says, no, not all men and women, or all people. So right there, so sometimes people say, is there any kind of early suffragism, and how is she standing on that? Right there, she's picking up on that idea. I promised you a quick visit to her visit to Leeds, and so I'll share that with you, and then I will finish with a speech, one of her greatest speeches, and so you can hear a little bit of her voice, but also it's a speech that sums up everything about her and her career, and I also think is very relevant to the political moment that we're living in. But first of all, she was, of course, the child of a Jewish family. Marx himself was born Halevi, and his father changed his name when he was 6 years old so that he could continue practicing law in the Rhineland, Jews having been prohibited to continue practicing in any professions unless they converted to Christianity, which is what Marx's father, Herschel Halevi, and all his brothers and sisters, but not his mother, did. But famously, Marx had no more interest in his Jewishness than any other form of religion. But later in life, Eleanor became interested. She was the only member of the Marx family who was interested in her Jewishness. And one of the things that I found out when I was writing the book, that this was largely to do with the fact that it was through discovering. She didn't believe that there was, to put it bluntly, she didn't believe that there was race, there was ethnic prejudice or religious division within the trade union movement when she first got involved. And it was through the Jewish trade unions that she discovered that, in fact, there was chauvinism. And this touches on her visit to Leeds, and she then became a great leader of organising the Jewish trade unions. In October 1890, Eleanor accepted an invitation to speak at the Great Assembly Hall, that's in London, to this new federation of Jewish unions. There were hat makers and boot makers and so forth, with a clear assertion of her father's ancestry. He would have been appalled. Dear comrade, I shall be very glad to speak at the meeting on November 1st, the more glad that my father was a Jew. And hear him spinning. Eleanor was invited to speak to Jewish unions in Leeds and Bradford, which drew her attention to the latent cultural and religious nationalism within the independent Labour Party, which she had helped form. She was at the founding meeting and had worked on that, having worked in the Socialist League with William Morris. She saw the evidence of anti-Semitic attitudes within the ranks of the ILP and the TUC of the time. Eleanor consistently identified herself as a Jew at public meetings. A story about a memorable incident at the Leeds Hall Institute is unsubstantiated but indicative, so let's just believe it was true. Eleanor was invited to speak, but on arrival was prevented. She began to speak from where she was standing, shouting out, "I am a Jewess." Many years later, Edward Bernstein described Eleanor as nearly Zionistic, but there's no evidence to support this view. And I go on to talk a bit about that. But that happened at the International as well. Big socialist internationals, and there were 18 Jewish unions who had been properly deputed and had brought their articles and their resolutions, and day after day after day their resolutions were not put in the schedule, and they came to her and she said, right, I will deal with this. And she used her position on the platform, and she stood up in Brussels and she said, I have in my hand the resolutions of, I think it was like 16 or 18 Jewish British trade unions, and these are the resolutions that we are putting down. So she pushed against that. To move to an aspect, to talk a little bit about her trade unionism, to move to the question of her internationalism, but also her profound belief in social democracy and indeed ultimately in parliamentary democracy. And as I mentioned, she was between 1880 and 1890 very, founded with William Morris and cohorts the Socialist League. Of course, they parted company, although fairly amicably. And she then went on to be very involved in the latter part of her life in the founding of both the Independent Labour Party, the ILP, and the Scottish Labour Party, the SLP. A trade unionist, a feminist, a socialist, and an internationalist. And she also, because obviously she hadn't done enough already, she also was one of the people who, above all others, and certainly within Britain, who was responsible for the introduction of May Day as an annual holiday to dance around and get drunk and sort of shag around the maypole. No, why not? Why not? Why couldn't the workers have a day off? But actually it wasn't. It was a day to focus international labour and all supporting organisations on the international, at that time, campaign for the 8-hour working day that she had spent 18 to 20 years of her life within trade unions and within other socialist federations fighting and working for. And that resolution she put forward in 1889, and in 1890, as I'm sure many of you will know, the first May Day happened in London, in Hyde Park, and Eleanor Marx was one of the people who made a speech. And this speech, I think, encompassed her socialist internationalism, her commitment to British trade unionism, and the need for a parliamentary Labour Party to represent British working people. So you can see that this child has moved a very long way from the thinking of both of her fathers. So this thing of that Eleanor Marx was in the shadow of her father is all very nice from a sort of Freudian and what I call lazy boy history point of view, but it's just simply not true. I also want to, before I read this, just put it in the context of human rights attrition and abuses and problems that we now face. Reading this in Britain, reading this speech, I've noticed, has changed very much from before the election and after the election. I read it in Brighton shortly after the election and could sort of really feel that it felt different. And I think that in terms of the commitment to internationalism, particularly at the moment where we face a threat to the Human Rights Act, where we have this vicious language of anti-immigration and emergent nationalism, that I think we can sort of hear how very much Eleanor Marx speaks to our current day. We have not come to do the work of political parties, but we have come here in the cause of labour, in its own defence, to demand its own rights. I can remember when we came in handfuls of a few dozen to Hyde Park to demand an 8 hours bill. But the dozens have grown to hundreds and hundreds to thousands until we have this magnificent demonstration. Those of us who have gone through all the worry of the dock strike, and especially the gas workers' strike, and have seen the men, women and children stand round us, have had enough of strikes, and we are determined to secure an 8 hours day by legal enactment. Unless we do so, it will be taken from us at the first opportunity. We will only have ourselves to blame if we do not achieve the victory which this great day could so easily give us. I used to leave the next paragraph out, but since the last election I put it in, and it'll make you laugh, you'll see why. There is in the park this afternoon a man whom Mr. Gladstone once imprisoned, Michael Davitt, but Mr. Gladstone is now on the best of terms with him. What do you suppose is the reason for this change? Why has the Liberal Party been so suddenly converted to Home Rule? Simply because the Irish people sent 80 members of the House of Commons to support the Conservatives. In the same way, we must kick these liberal and radical members out if they refuse to support our programme. I am speaking this afternoon not only as a trade unionist, but as a socialist. Socialists believe that the 8 hours day is the first and most immediate step to be taken, and we aim at a time when there will no longer be one class supporting two others, but the unemployed both at the top and the bottom of society will be got rid of. This is not the end, but only the beginning of the struggle. It is not enough to come here to demonstrate in favour of an 8 hours day. We must not be like some Christians who sin for 6 days and go to church on the 7th. But we must speak for the cause daily and make the men, and especially the women that we meet, come into the ranks to help us. And at this concluding point, Eleanor paused, and then she rolled out Shelley's great thunderous invocation to working class Englishmen and women in The Mask of Anarchy, and also Tony Benn, the late Tony Benn's favourite poem. Rise like lions after slumber in unconquerable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few.